Good.
Everybody's here.
Good.
All right.
I just can't see you just yet. So
So we're on YouTube. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hey, everybody. Hey, Robert. Ron.
How's everyone doing?
All right.
I'm Alex, if anyone hasn't met me.
Okay, we got Alex, we got Robert, and we got Nick, and myself, Ron. I think that's perfect. Perfect amount of people for doing this type of a show. We're doing, so anybody that knows, we're doing our 5 favorite albums from 1982, not the best ones, because that can be very debatable. I think it's really everyone's opinion. So I figure I use the word favorite instead of best, and what we're going to do here is we're going to go from me to Alex, to Robert, to Nick's.
Okay.
So, I know. So, all right. Like I said, I'll start off. This is one that I got. Now I don't have the actual album of one. It's the first Asia, and this particular one has all the first 3 ones, the Wetton ones. But again, all the ones I have here, I never got them on original release date or date year. I got them maybe a few years to decades later. But Asia, of course, all the two hits from there, Heat of the Moment and Only Time Will Tell, were plastered all over MTV, and that's what got me interested in that. Before that, I knew nothing of basically John Wetton. I knew of the other 3, but I didn't know anything about John Wetton. But I was just enamored by his voice and his bass tone and everything. But then deeper dive, I like the other tracks better than the ones that they plastered over the hits. I mean, they're good, but I think these ones are better, in my opinion. I know a lot of people say, okay, these 4 prog giants got together and everybody was expecting some sort of prog supergroup, but then we got basically a mainstream rock band, and that's cool. I mean, it was the 80s. It's like, we're not going to continue what we did in the 70s. We're going to do something new. At least that's what I'm sure they were all thinking. I know Wetton came from Crimson and UK, to name a few, and Palmer from ELP. I knew of him, and Jeff Downes and Steve Howe I knew from Yes. I knew those 2, but those 3, but I never knew Wetton until that point. Next one's, I guess some people could call this a guilty pleasure. I used to say that, but then I got to the point where I said, fuck it, it's not. Duran Duran Rio. I mean, I know these guys are, were the darlings of early MTV, and a little more on the mainstream, because a lot of people say that you can hear their influences of the band Japan in there, and some of the early or Roxy music in there a little bit, and a lot of other things, but mostly kind of like danceable music, but it was still had a rock thing going to it.
It
Later
had
on,
great production quality too.
Oh yeah, and this particular one that I got, it's a 2 disc set that it has some demos and non-tracks and B-sides and different versions and remixes. You know, it's like, I mean, if there was a band in the '80s to have remixes, you know, they were the one. You know, and then I got Eloy, Time to Turn. I didn't get into Eloy until the mid '90s, and I don't remember who got me into it, but a good friend of mine did, and I do believe I know who he is. He says you got to check these guys out, and he liked the '80s output of Eloy as opposed to the '70s. He said the '70s. He said they sounded way too much like Pink Floyd. Is that in the '80s they had a little more of an identity? You still heard that Pink Floyd, but then they, on some of the albums, it got a little hard rocky sounds. And this one, I mean, it has a lot of great songs. I mean, none of them were hits, you know, but you know, it didn't really matter. They were really good songs. I mean. And then another one that I got into in the mid '90s, King Crimson Beat.
Oh yeah.
Good album.
I know a lot of people prefer the Discipline of the '80s version of King Crimson, but you know this one, Discipline, Beat, and Three of a Perfect Pair. That was a nice little trilogy, you know, and people were expecting, you know, I think a lot of people, even in the progressive world, we expecting duplicates of, you know, and we get kind of annoyed sometimes when bands do something a little different, and we go, no, you can't do that. You know, you have to stay the same. And then there's bands that actually do that. Each album sounds like it's a duplicate of the previous one, and I mean, and people go, you know, they drool over that stuff, and that's okay. But you know, you can't really call that progressive rock in name. That's all it is. It's in name. It's not in what it's supposed to do. And my last one, Rush 6. I was listening to this all week, and today when I was out running some errands, I had that thing cranked up because all I could hear in cars next to me is this new, you know, the thumping music. So I was like, okay, I had to drown it out, and it was great. This is great to drown out, you know? Especially the first 2 tracks. I mean, Subdivisions and The Analog Kid. I mean, those 2 are pretty powerful tracks, and the whole album was great. I got into Rush. Now, this was one I got into Rush in the mid '80s, so I didn't get this on, again, like I didn't get any of these on release dates, but I got this somewhere, I think, one 85 or 86. And by that time, no, I do remember I got it after Grace Under Pressure. I got it after that because that was one of the very few record albums that I bought at the time. All I was buying was cassettes, and I don't know why I bought that one on record. I guess because of the artwork, you know, but because I didn't really have a record player. My parents had the record player, so it's like I had to wait till they leave so I could put it on the record player to listen to it, you know. So it's like with a cassette, I have my Walkman or my little boombox. So yeah, I think after that, a lot of I always see on different forums that people start to get disappointed with Rush after that, and then when you know, it's like I just think, you know, again, they were changing with the times. You know, they were trying new things, and I don't think they really cared if the critics liked it. I think they're doing it because I guess you call the true fans understood where they were going, and I'm sure you guys must have seen them live. I never got a chance to.
Many, many, many times.
And I never got a chance to see them.
Not me.
I had some almost chances with them. Same with Duran Duran. I had tickets for it, but the person that I was supposed to go with, they got in trouble, so they were my ride. I didn't know what else to do, so I was scrambling around, and I saw these girls that looked like they would like Duran Duran, and I said, "You want to go to Duran Duran tonight?" And they, screamed like little schoolgirls, "Yeah, yeah, yeah!" And I said, "Okay, face value, okay." And so I missed opportunities. There were so many missed opportunities to see classic bands in their prime. I could have seen Styx back in the early '80s, but I don't remember the date. But I think Tommy Shaw broke his arm, so they had to reschedule, and they didn't know when they were going to reschedule. So they offered us, the refund on the ticket. So I took it and never got to see them. So it's like so many bands, that's why if I could build a time machine.
Oh, well.
But those were my 5. I mean, and they're a little more on the not so much light side, but more kind of a mainstream feel. I know a lot of people. I had some friends that would be kind of surprised if I put in a Duran Duran album, because they don't know that that's the kind of stuff that I was listening to back in the early '80s, up until about '85, '86, when my best friend got me into heavy metal, and then I sold all those stuff and got heavy metals. All right, Alex. Hey.
So, hey, so I'm presenting stuff that's a little less mainstream, not known terribly well at all. I hope it's appropriate. So my first selection here will be the Weather Report album that's just titled Weather Report.
Yes.
From 1982. It's the last album with Jocko before he died. And I've always been a heavy Weather Report fan since the early '70s. I think ever since Heavy Weather came out. And then I started backtracking and going on their older catalog too. They got some great stuff that's very krautrocky. So the one pop album that I liked is the band called The Fix, and the album is called Shuttered Room. And there was a couple of big songs on that one. There's Red Skies at Night, and a couple of other ones that were pretty popular back in the day. Go ahead.
Beautiful stuff.
Yeah, great guitar player. I'll give him that for sure. So my next selection is going to be Universe Zero, their first album.
Oh, a classic.
Which is, I think, a great album, and
really
it's
dark.
Right, very dark. In those days, Rock in Opposition, RIO, was not a style of music. It was a collection of bands who decided they didn't like the way the industry was going. So it was the RIO bands from the '70s were fusion. There were also some progressive rock, and there were some avant-garde bands too. So it's not really a style. It's really it was a movement to try to go against the industry. And this is back in the late '70s. They had a couple of concerts, I think, where they had a few different bands playing. Henry Cow was part of it. Mm-hmm. So the next album I'm going to bring up here is, let me see if I can find it, Lethique. Hang on here. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Let me bring this one up. It's I found this great site. Here it is. Richard Pinhas Lethig. Richard Pinhas was a part of the French underground movement. Did a lot of electronic type of music. Some of it consider an offshoot of Magma. He played with a variety of people that are offshoots of Magma, and he may have even played briefly with Magma. Um, so I'm not really quite sure how that fits in the Magma oeuvre. And then there's, I guess I have two more selections. I'm going to mention Didier Lockwood, who was a Magma um, alumnus, and he did an album called Fasten Seatbelts in 1982, which I thought was not too bad for the time. Wasn't quite his best output. His first album that he did in '79 was probably his best, but I still consider him one of my favorite musicians. And I burned out the vinyl when I bought it back when it was released, right around 77, was it 73, 74? So, and I think for the last thing I'm going to mention, Michael Manring. Michael Manring's a bass player who studied under Jaco Pastorius. There's an album he did called, that he was a part of. It's called An Evening with Wyndham Hill. Wyndham Hill went under the New Age thing, but these guys were not New Age. They were way beyond that for sure. They also included Shadowfax, and Shadowfax hated that. I know the guitar player pretty well, G.E. Stinson, but Michael Manring is still active today, and he does a lot more experimental work now. He's done a couple of albums, I think, with was it Percy Jones? I think he did some work with Percy Jones. So I think those are the albums that I'll be presenting for that time period.
Cool.
All right, Robert,
Very
you're
good.
up.
Yeah. Okay. My turn. Okay. Well, guys, thank you for letting me into this group, and I'll talk about some of my albums from that era that I really, really liked, all from 1982. First one is, well, the Alan Parsons Project, Eye in the Sky. Well, when I listened to the album for the first time, Sirius was that great Alan Parsons riff that sounded like Eve or Turn of a Friendly Card. It really sounded great. But then there was this big single title track, Eye in the Sky, which was a soft buck, radio ready song that played on every radio in the world at the time. It was their most popular album, Grammy Award winning album. It's Alan Parsons' moment of glory, literally. Yeah, there were plenty of great tunes on it, like Old and Wise and Gemini, and Psychobabble was that attempt to recapture the energy of I Wouldn't Want to Be Like You from iRobot. It sounded a bit similar. Anyway, it was a great album, and I really clicked on it. I got it from the Columbia Record Club.
Yeah.
Everybody was on that.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, that was good. That was good. Okay. Wanted to show it. I got the album on vinyl. Then there's my second album is going to be Famous Last Words by Supertramp. It's really a tour I remember fondly seeing at the Old Montreal Forum. It was the last album with Roger Hodgson in the band, and it's another album that featured prominently the divide between Rick Davies and his bluesy numbers, like Put On Your Old Brown Shoes and My Kind of Lady, and the really popular proggier tracks from Hodgson, Don't Leave Me Now, It's Raining Again, Crazy. Yeah. it was really, you know, a complete division. It was like two complete different bands. And it was the swan song of the band because technically, I have to admit, the stuff after this with Davies at the helm didn't catch on. Even their album, Brother Where You Bound, with David Gilmour on guitar, didn't click really big time. And well, Ogson's career was mostly acoustic and full orchestra shows for the past 40 years. It's been highly successful. I mean, I'm good for him. But yeah, it's not, you know, Supertramp just disappeared after that band for me. Anyway, so album number 3. Woo! Peter Gabriel. It's Peter Gabriel 4, the Shock the Monkey or security album, as they call it. Well, you know what? It was kind of hard to surpass the gigantic album before that, you know, with Peter Gabriel 3, with Biko, I don't remember, and Games Without Frontiers. But he did it. He did it. The 4th album was really intense. It had the powerful Rhythm of the Heat. That's an amazing track. The classic singles, San Jacinto, Lay Your Hands on Me, and of course the very, very popular radio hit Shock the Monkey. It had great production quality, and it featured all of his usual team, you know, with Tony Levin, David Rhodes, Jerry Marotta on drums, and Larry Fast. So yeah, that was a great, great, great album. After that, my 4th album, classic album from that era. Everybody had it in its collection at one time or another. 3 Sides Live by Genesis. Great, great, great classic album. It's a wonderful seminal live album that kind of captured the 3 eras of Genesis. You know, the Gabriel era, the Hackett era, but mostly the Collins trio era. It sounded great, almost better than you know, the Seconds Out. The US and the Canadian version had some B-sides and EP tracks on side 4, but the UK version had 4 sides live, which kind of featured One for Divine, Fountain Salamis, and a hit with the wonderful ending of Watcher of the Skies. At the you know, at the time it was a must in everyone's collection. So that's my 4th album, and finally the 5th album. It's kind of an unusual selection, but for me it was a great album that I discovered many years after, but really enjoyed it. Blue Oyster Cult Extraterrestrial Live. It was a live album. You know, Blue Oyster Cult at that time was releasing quite a bit of live albums, but this one in particular was good because it had all the great classic tracks like City on Flame with rock and roll, Godzilla, Don't Fear the Reaper, and personally, Black Blade. You know, I was a big fan of the Cultosaurus Erectus album, so it was great that he added it on the album. It was released during the Black and Blue tour with Black Sabbath. Most of it was recorded in late 1981. You know, it sounded great and a really great energy to it. So, you know, I kind of clicked on that album. So those are my 5 albums.
The Supertramp one I fondly remember is when I played that, my mom loved that song, It's Raining Again.
Well,
She
yeah.
loved that song. So that kind of brings back some very good memories of how do you say, a more simpler time. Yeah, a lot of those I didn't have when they were released. But yeah, all right.
Can I make just one more mention I forgot
Sure.
that I wanted to mention, and that was Pat Metheny's Off Ramp.
Oh.
I burned that album out. Anyways,
Good stuff. Yes, indeed. Hi,
Okay.
Nick. Tell
Hey.
me.
Anyways, Nick.
Oh,
Talk
well,
about your stuff.
I got to tell you, I was going through that list of 1982, and if I was to list my favorite albums from that era, we'd be here next week. There was a lot of great stuff.
Oh yeah.
When Ron told me that he wanted to do 1982, I'm thinking to myself, just thinking, how many albums came out then? I mean, I knew there were some really good ones, but I just didn't think there were that many till I went to Wikipedia, and I was blown away. Live albums, just live albums alone, we could have covered and done a show on. I mean, there was some great live material that was out there. And what I love about what's happening this morning is so far no one has picked the same stuff, which is really great because now hopefully we're introducing people to stuff that they may have never heard. And I love the Magma shirt, by the way.
Yes, it's a great shirt.
I'm not a big fan of theirs, but that logo is so iconic. It's like the Genesis album,
Right.
not Genesis, the King Crimson album.
Oh yeah, Lark's tongue and not Lark tongue. I was talking about the face.
Right. I mean, there's just some albums you see.
Oh, yeah.
You don't even have to know the name of it, but you know it as soon as you see it.
Yeah.
So this was really tough because I didn't want to really pick albums, and these albums that I picked, I have, but I would say that there's probably 80% of the albums on Wikipedia that I actually owned at one time or another in CD, LP forms, one or the other. Right. So I wanted to pick out stuff, I think, by bands that actually influenced other musicians. So I'm going to start off with one. It's their second album. The band was called Demon. The album is called The Unexpected Guest. This was they went from metal to prog metal, but mostly on the metal side. But the follow-up, The Plague, was highly a progressive metal album. So I think these guys influenced a lot of the prog metal movement. If you really look at a lot of the bands that are out there that are popular, they were influenced by somebody, right? Even the Beatles were influenced by somebody. So I think that Demon really was one of those bands. And this was their second album. Came out April 2nd of 82. Really, really good album.
It came out on my birthday.
Oh, really? Now, my second album, and these are in no order, by the way, so I'm not going to say number 1, number 2, number 4, because I don't want to classify them as one being more important than the other. I think they're all, to me, they were all important to me for a reason, whether it was a song or whatever. And like Ron, all the albums I've purchased throughout my life, even to this day, I would say that better than 80% of the albums I've purchased were never purchased because I heard something by the band. I purchased because of the album artwork, who produced it, who mastered it, where it was mastered, who guested on it. So if it was an album that was designed by Hypnosis, you almost could guarantee a quality release. If it was produced by Max Norman, or there's just so many great producers out there. Chris Kimsey, just some wonderful people out there, and it doesn't matter what genre. The second one I'm gonna pick is not my favorite album by the band, but the album that put the band on the map in America, and that is Cut by Golden Earring. Featured the song Twilight Zone, which was really, really big. But it also features some great songs like The Devil Made Me Do It. Really good album. This one came out September 10th, 1982. Next one makes me think of Nick Beggs whenever I play this album, because it came out in the same era and had that same kind of feel. The band was called Haircut 100.
Oh yeah.
Pelican West, which actually stood for Haircut $1, and that just didn't sound right, so they called it Haircut 100, and featured quite a few hits off of this album.
Yeah, I remember.
And this one came out in February of 1982. Next band influenced a lot of people. Features, of course, Danny Elfman, who has
Oh yeah, Oingo. I know you're talking about.
done some solo stuff, but his music, not only has he become a brilliant composer for soundtracks like the Batman movies, but tons, not even just the franchise ones, he's done tons. But the band that he came from and is still promoting, which kind of bothers me because he hates the band, but yet he goes out and performs the hits of the band. And that is the band Oingo Boingo.
Oingo. Hey, did you know they did a movie, an avant-garde movie that was really funny?
Yes, I have the album for that as well.
It's hilarious.
Yes, it is. So the album is called Nothing to Fear, but fear itself, really. And just a classic album. Again, this band, I think, introduced, they were really on the avant-garde, kind of art rock. They started off in the punk movement, but they were never really a punk band like the Police. The Police, when they first came out, everyone called them a punk band, but I'm sorry, you got a jazz musician in the band and a guitarist.
2 jazz musicians.
Yeah. I mean, Andy Summers was playing for the Animals and Mike Oldfield way before the Police, right? So, I mean, far from punk, but somehow some of these bands actually got lumped into that category.
Right.
The next one, you guys were talking about Peter Gabriel, and I wanted to pick him, but again, I wanted to stay away because I had a feeling that if I stood away from you guys and really went after some of the avant-garde stuff, that we'd get a little bit more information out there maybe. Peter Gabriel worked with this artist in 1982, prior to this album. He worked with her on her first album. Her name is Laurie Anderson. The album is called Big Science.
Great album.
Fantastic album. Now, this is a reissue. I burnt out my first couple on vinyl. This one comes on red vinyl, if I'm correct. It came out recently. But anything that she's ever done, I just love the fact she was, again, she was avant-garde. She was art rock. At times, like Kate Bush, she was progressive. You really couldn't put a finger on what she was. When I was growing up, in the 70s, 60s and 70s, music really didn't have definitions. We didn't have prog rock, art rock, blues rock. We had blues, jazz, soundtrack, classical. We had like 5 or 6 categories, and that's kind of where they fell under. And so people like Kate Bush and Anderson, people had a hard time defining what it was. Right. And I think that's what made music great from our youth, because when I was growing up, and we're all about the same age, so we can pretty much remember what radio used to be versus what it is now.
Right.
So if you were listening to any radio station anywhere in the world, you would hear Jimi Hendrix and Mamas and the Papas, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, yes, Genesis, Tom Jones, John Denver, Joni Mitchell, Creedence Clearwater, Steppenwolf, and I could go on about the diversity of the music. You hear Motown mixed in with it. To me, that was the golden era of music. Was the 70s and 80s. 80s it started to die out on radio, but maybe even the 50s through 70s for radio was the golden era, because we were educated into all kinds of music. We didn't just like a certain style.
Yeah,
that's
I know. I noticed in the '80s that's when we, had to, you were lumped in. You were either a metalhead or, a punk
exactly.
or something like that. And it's like, I mean, now I look back, it's like, geez, a lot of those styles, they kind of in a way, some of them kind of complemented each other. Like
Oh yeah.
metal and punk, right there. They had that angst.
Here's an example of 1982, This Heat, SPQR, Last Live. These guys started off as punk in the late 70s, but moved into prog, and they became kind of um, avant-garde proggers. The music is a little noisy and a little industrial, but it was forward-thinking. And it
Right.
shows that the 80s, they were starting to intermix all the different styles. And they'd finally gotten to the point where the punkers who were so pissed off at the proggers stopped being pissed off and they started doing things together.
There were
And
actually
when,
quite a few punk bands that slowly reverted and became prog bands.
right. This Heat didn't. They'd always been experimental, but they were bringing some of those prog influences in. The other thing was, when I was a teenager in Boston, which would be in the early 70s, there was this radio station, WBUR in Boston, and it was a college station, and they would play the entire the entire side two of Phaedra from Tangerine Dream, back to back with Isotope, the entire Illusion first side. So it gave me and like you said, it was a huge diversity of what they would play. And they didn't pigeonhole anything. They'd play anything.
Yeah, and I think that's a problem with radio today. I mean, not FM radio, because FM radio still pretty much has a broad spectrum, even though it's still very narrow at the same time. Because in rock, if you listen to a rock station, it's kind of all over rock, but it's some of it's good, some of it's bad. I don't believe in good and bad music. I believe that there's something for everybody.
Right.
I may not like a punk band, but that doesn't mean that band does not have relevance to somebody else. So I really despise when someone says that this band sucks or this genre sucks.
Right.
Because, when I was growing up, the Beatles and the Monkees were our boy band, right?
Yeah.
So, whether it's NSYNC or Backstreet Boys or Justin Bieber, that's the young generation's boy band. And they're going to grow out of it, and they're going to grow into something else. No one's going to stay an NSYNC fan forever, and they haven't.
Right.
And that's the thing about progressive. I love the term, but I hate the term. It's a love.
Yeah.
Yep. Because it really, people have a hard time with it. And they'll go, there's two types of people. They'll go, I don't know what prog is. And you go, Pink Floyd. And they'll go, oh, I don't like Pink Floyd. So you've just blown it out of the water, and they will never listen to anything else you recommend because they think everything sounds like Pink Floyd. And then there are those that, for example, you were saying something earlier, Ron, and I thought it was really funny because if it doesn't sound like Genesis, it's not prog. But if it sounds like Genesis, it's not prog.
Yeah.
Right? To me, the term progressive has a total different meaning than most people. Most people believe that progressive is a genre. And while it can be associated as a genre, it really means that you're progressing. Robert Plant and Alison Krauss, when they released their debut album, was progressive bluegrass. There was nothing normal. It wasn't a bluegrass album. It wasn't a rock album. It was progressive. It was a culmination of all kinds of great music.
Yeah, and then there's some interesting musicians who really don't like to have the prog tag applied to them, like Dave Kerman. Dave Kerman is a drummer, and he wants nothing to do with prog. He says, call me fusion, call me anything else but that. Because a lot of us prog heads have a tendency, as we were mentioning before earlier, Ron, to be stuck in the past.
Yep.
Yeah. I think we are stuck in the past. We want, like I said earlier, they want, there's a group of people that want bands to sound, their next album to sound like the previous one because they feel like in a safe zone.
Right.
And if if they're calling themselves progressive rock, they really have to understand what the word progressive means and how it applies to your music. I think it really, I mean, at the base core of it means that album one or album two isn't going to sound like album one, and so
Right.
on and so on.
Right.
You're going to hear their how do you say, their signature sound. You're going to hear that throughout their discography, but when they can go and, if they were a band that never used synthesizers and then all of a sudden they want to get into that, like Rush, in the early days in the 70s, they weren't really heavy into synthesizers. But then once later in the 70s, then they started dabbling in that. And I think that's where their evolution, they had an evolution to their sound. And that's what I like to hear.
But I think also claiming that a band that uses synthesizers or Moogs or keyboards or whatever, that they're a prog band, does again makes them not a prog band. There's bands out there that are progressive that are just guitar orientated.
Right.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
I prefer to call the genre just rock and roll.
Right.
You define it for whatever you want. I think to pigeonhole something, anything. Last night I heard a term. A friend of mine was here who lives in Norway. Some of you may know him, some of you may not. But anyways, he was visiting. He has a house here that he comes to stay at a couple times a year, and we always get together and listen to new music and stuff. And we were listening to some melodic rock bands, and he goes, "Oh, this is what we call poodle rock." And I thought to myself, because it's not rock, and it's not heavy metal. It's in between. Now, in between, when I was growing up, was hard rock, right?
Yeah.
I mean, even Led Zeppelin was again thrown in with the heavy metal, and the first album was blues, and they never were a metal band. So another label that really, I mean, progressive is bad, right? But poodle rock is really bad. And another one that's even worse is yacht rock.
Yacht rock. I heard that one.
Sorry,
it's
not yacht rock. America, Chicago.
Yeah.
Roy Orbison. They're not. What the hell?
Right.
I never understood that yacht rock thing. All I could think of is that bands that dress up with captain's hats or something.
Actually, the term came from the era when that stuff was coming out. The so-called yacht rock in the late 70s, early 80s was kind of what the yuppies would listen to.
Exactly.
It was AOR, adult orientated rock, is what it really stands for. And the yuppies would sit and listen to them on their yachts, supposedly, right? It's like, I'm sorry, I didn't have a yacht, and
we didn't have a yacht. No,
those guys, right? First time I heard the term, I thought they were talking about the band, the Yachts.
Oh.
I love that band.
But speaking on labels, I have a little story. Back when we were organizing the FMPM festival, prog rock festival in Montreal, at one point there was this patron who came to me and said, there's some bands that you're playing at your festival. Well, that's not prog. I mean, like stuff like Interference Sardines. What the hell is that? That's not.
Oh, those guys are great. I love those guys.
I said to him, your view of progressive rock is that classic neo prog rock doesn't exist anymore. Forget about that. Prog rock is encompassing a lot of stuff, and we had bands that were, all over the place. We had stuff like the Strawbs, we had IQ, we had Italian prog rock bands like Le Orme. I mean, it was completely different. We had actually Univers Zero that played at our festival, followed by Riverside. I mean, that's stuff that's completely different. That was the success of our festival. We had a vast variety
And that's
of
what it should
musical
be.
styles.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what you want because, like at Nearfest, for example, although I didn't go to a whole lot of festivals, Nearfest, Prague Day were the two that I really went to. And Nearfest, they played Magma, they played Thinking Plague, but they also had FM and they also had, uh, Osric Tentacles was there. They played a wide variety of things, and that was kind of nice. The only trouble with Nearfest is it was the same 1,000 guys every year. They weren't getting new blood, and that means that they needed to get some bands that had something different. But
Right.
Prague, they would have everything. They had Deus Ex Machina, they had a bunch of bands from Japan, they had Ars Nova, they had all kinds of different styles of music playing,
And
and it would bring
I think
around
Prague Day is
everybody.
happening now, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's happening this weekend.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's 2 days of Prague plus one in Europe. So in
Oh
Italy.
wow.
What's
So
in
you got-
Europe?
In Italy, the 2 days of Prague plus one.
Oh, okay.
Hawkwind is
Oh.
playing, Atomic Rooster.
Atomic Rooster. Wow.
That's very cool.
Is Carl Palmer playing with them?
I don't think there's any member that's original to that band anymore.
Oh, okay.
I think it's, and I have a problem with that when someone goes out and they're touring under the name of.
Yeah,
They
I've
should be-
been.
when
Yeah,
they-
and there's no original
they should
band
be
members.
called-
Yeah,
right. They should be called a tribute band at some point. Just
Right.
because you played in a version of that band, and you may have recorded some albums, but you
Something's
weren't in the
burning.
band when it was originally formed. And now that everyone's dead, you're the only original, and you weren't even an original
Right.
to call it.
That'd be
Right.
a great. That'd be a great show to talk about bands that that don't have any original members, and whether or not they, like you said, be a tribute band or
Well,
or
and
anything.
then there's some of these bands like Neutrals. You're familiar with the Neutrals, right? From
No.
Italy.
Yeah.
They did one album was prog, one album was pop, and then the next album was like experimental jazz fusion stuff. And that's because they were constantly rolling over the members of the band.
Right.
So it's always interesting to see that kind of change and how it goes through the time. Because you had, there was another band from Italy called Perigio who did straight up fusion stuff. They did about 25 albums. But once the 80s roll around, they were doing disco.
That's
Very
Yeah,
funny.
It's funny how some bands actually, I never thought about that till I was watching a special on TV, one of those Netflix specials about music, and they were doing a piece on some era, and I'm going, I remember these bands. Oh my God, they sound just like. Oh, they sound just like.
Yeah,
they,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
but-
And that's a problem. That's definitely a problem because now you've associated, now you're starting to make an association with
Right.
something instead of it's just music. It's music.
right,
Right.
and that's how I grew up with it being just music.
You either like it or you don't. And if you don't
Right.
like it, that's okay. There's
Oh,
nothing
and
wrong with that.
Interesting thing about, and I'm sure Nick knows the original name for Oingo Boingo.
Oh, those guys were really, I love those,
Those
that band.
Satanic Majesties, or
No, Mystic Knights of the Oingo Boingo.
right, yeah.
But
Mystic
can you
Knights.
imagine an announcer having to say that? So I can understand why they shrunk it down to Oingo Boingo, and they even shrunk it down to just Boingo for.
Yeah, towards the end, but
Yeah.
Hey, guys, I got to step away for a minute. I'm smelling something burning.
All right. Well, thanks. Hey, thanks for joining us.
No, I'll stay here. I'll be right back. I'm
Okay.
just going for a
All
moment.
right. Yeah, that's 82 had a lot of stuff that when I was growing up, that again, like you're saying, labels. I mean, the early part of the 80s was my most, I want to say, my weird period, because I was listening to hard rock stuff. I was listening to regular rock, which is almost like sometimes I couldn't understand because some of those bands kind of blended with each other. And then pop music, obviously everybody knows what pop, that was, or top 40, I think I was listening to more top 40 stuff in the early 80s than anything. And that's where Um, some were good, some were very, dated. That's the one thing I noticed with the early '80s in comparison to the latter part of the '80s is some of the early '80s stuff really didn't get that dated as much as like from '86 on, because when you listen to those ones, it's almost like they ran out of ideas and stuff, and there were very few of them actually did have some good ideas, like Peter Gabriel, he was one, but then his album became from released every once a year to every few years to like, longer.
I think the late '80s had a lot of good stuff. You had NXS, for example, or Depeche Mode.
Oh, yeah.
Both were very, very creative bands.
There was a very big underground scene in the whole '80s from early to end. And you had these punk bands who were playing, 3-chord songs who got tired of that stuff after a couple of years, and they listened to like Captain Beefheart. They started listening to Captain Beefheart albums, and then you could hear that influence starting to come into their music. Captain Beefheart isn't for everybody, but
yeah, the underground stuff. That stuff to this day flourishes, and that's where we get, especially in the current times, that's where we get a lot of our music. Stuff that doesn't classify or qualify.
Right, you can't classify. Here's another one. This album that's got This Heat and Albert Marcoeur. Albert Marcoeur was heavily influenced by Frank Zappa, and he started doing a little bit more pop stuff in the '80s. I don't know if you heard any of it in the late '80s. And of course, This Heat, which I mentioned before, they were started off as a punk band, and then they started getting into sort of industrial noise. But you could see that sort of Trout Mask replica starting to influence things and a lot of different things. Even the Fix, those guys were clearly influenced. The bass player for the Fix, guess where he came from? Isotope. The Isotope a Deep End album has this guy named Dan Brown on it. He's the bass player for the Fix. So there's this cross-pollination all over the place.
Yeah, that Fix album that you had, I was looking for it to get it on CD because I got the
I think it's out of print.
It's out of print, and it's like over $50 or $60.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, geez, this is an anniversary year for that.
Yeah.
Couldn't they
reissue it? Right.
Even if it didn't have a new mix, just reissue it so people can.
And they're still playing. They still tour, and they're still playing tunes off the album.
Yeah, and they got a new one too.
Oh, that's true. That's right. And in conclusion, 1982, there are some albums that we did not mention. I'll, touch them very, very quickly. Avalon has, Roxy Music had their album, Avalon, which was, a seminal album. With, everybody knows that particular one. In the jazz world, you had Donald Fagen, who had his solo album, The Night Fly. Van Halen has its album, Diver Down.
Yeah.
And of course, Michael Jackson has the monstrous Thriller album. And Iron Maiden, Number of the Beast. But my absolute favorites from that era, I have to mention them. New Gold Dream by The Simple Minds. Man, that was a monster album. It was a complete turnaround for the band from going from, kind of a new wave weirdo stuff to super pop, really catchy stuff. That was one of the great albums. There was also Love Over Gold from Dire Straits, which
there were so many great albums from that era.
Yeah. Here's speaking of influencers. Oops. Alan Holdsworth was very influential on almost all guitar players, and that was the year that IOU came out.
Yep, saw that tour. Great tour.
Yeah,
Another
one
band that
another
crossed
one
over was
Talk Talk.
a band called Front 242. You remember them?
Oh yeah, he
They
played on
they would
one
eventually
album, didn't he?
huh?
I thought he played on one album for them.
I can't remember, but they did quite a few albums, and then they eventually became Delirium.
Oh,
Talk about really switching grooves, right?
right, changing
As you're
grooves.
going
Yeah,
from an industrial new wave punk band. I saw them with Netzer. They were amazing. And then they kind of crossed over to Delirium, and they got Sarah McLaughlin. McLaughlin? Is that how you say her name?
Yeah.
yeah, McLaughlin.
And so they added folk with new age, yet they were prog, they were artsy. So yeah, I mean, that's the thing about music that's great is these bands that keep morphing.
Right.
Something different.
Right.
Well, yeah, like that one band, Talk Talk, they went from the guy had kind of like a Brian Ferry style voice, and then all of a sudden they became, I guess, what people call post rock or something like that.
Yeah, they started to become kind of post rock. They were more on the melodic side. I think Hollis, who was the lead singer, went and actually started studying music, and then he became more interested in more theoretical music styles.
Right.
I think is what happened. There was another band that was like that called Susie Tissue. I don't know if you ever heard of them,
No.
but they were pretty much a straight up punk. I mean, those guys could barely play. And she actually went off to Berklee School of Music and released an album that was just, it was kind of like loops played on the piano. Susie Tissue was the album, and she released an album on her own. It's impossible to find. I found an MP3 rip of it, but it's really good. And it kind of predates what Tangerine Dream was sort of the kind of idea that they had, with sequencers.
You're talking about a show that you would discover like Tangerine Dream. There was a show that I used to listen to back in the 70s, and I can't remember the name of it now. And every Sunday night, you would hear nothing but soundscape type albums. So you'd hear Tangerine Dream, and you'd hear Vangelis and Synergy or Larry Fast, stuff. But it was really cool. You'd hear Goblin, right?
Yeah, and I love Goblin. I never heard Goblin until I saw Suspiria. Then I listened to them. I saw them. I saw them in 2005 in LA.
Nice.
Yeah, I got into them too. The same with Suspiria. I watched that movie and I'm like, going, what the hell is this music?
Well, the tour they're doing.
I felt like I was going into another realm.
Yep. So that's what they're touring on this tour. They're going to play the album in its entirety.
Oh
wow! Because in one of the videos that I saw on YouTube of those guys playing, the keyboard player, who's like the original keyboard player, was describing how they wrote that song. And it was kind of interesting. They just locked themselves in the studio for like 2 weeks or something, and they just played around with everything in the studio. It's a really interesting story to hear about that creative process. Because I don't consider myself creative at all, and so it's interesting to hear what that creative process is.
Yeah. I love looking on YouTube, trying to find when people discuss the creative process of making of an album.
Right.
Because then you get I think you get a deeper appreciation for it. If they did, more complex thing that you hear on the surface, there was more behind the scenes and stuff. I love that.
Right. Have you ever heard of Klaus Schulze?
Yep.
So he was with a band in the early 70s called the Galactic Supermarket, and it was part of the krautrock scene. They weren't electronic. They were pretty much the krautrock. Timothy Leary went with them into the studio, and they dropped acid for a week, and they came out with this one album. And it's very interesting to hear about how they came up with that.
Oh, boy, can imagine.
Yeah.
Well,
this probably show could go on for centuries.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
And hey, no problem. I think like Nick said earlier, I think the really ultimate goal for these things is education. Get
Yes.
people to go, oh, that sounded kind of interesting. Let me go check it out and see if it's something I really want, and then eventually just go buy.
Right.
That's what I love now, that we have the ease of going to listen to albums before we could go and buy them. You got things like Bandcamp, and then YouTube. You can listen to albums that are, most of them that are out of print, and the only way you can hear it is on YouTube, because even some of those albums don't go up on, places like Spotify. They don't go up there because they're, it's not as popular of a album when it came out. They had a cult following. It probably wouldn't be more than 5,000 people in the world that like this particular band or album.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact too, if the band's no longer together,
Yeah.
who's going to put it up on Spotify? On YouTube, it's fans that put that stuff up. You
Right.
can't-
Right. It's fans. Yeah.
you
The
can't be a
fans
fan
that put that up.
puts
Yeah.
on Spotify.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Definitely.
It's like, I mean,
There's definitely a lot of very eclectic old stuff that's been completely forgotten that's available on YouTube that, oh, wow, I never heard of that band, and nobody knows about that band anymore. But someone put, a couple of videos, and wow, I mean, they
Yeah,
don't
it's like-
exist anymore, but they're great to listen to, and it's great to discover them.
yeah, I mean, through the pandemic, I was listening to what people on Facebook were recommending, then go over to YouTube to listen to see what they say and what I'm hearing, if it's something that I'm interested in. I think there's at least 20 albums, CDs that I got just because of that. Never heard of them before and got them, and I'm like going, why didn't I hear of this? Because they weren't popular enough to get
Right.
airwave time and on the big radio stations. And at the time before MTV, you had radio, and then
And there's so much great material that would come from bands that were touring and releasing, preparing to release music. I can give you one example of a band in 1982 that nobody knew, but they were touring and doing shows, and everybody was loving their music. And in 1983. Just 1 year after our year, they released a little album called Script for a Jester's Tear. Marillion.
right.
Yeah, in 1982, they were a touring band. In 1983, they were a recording band.
Yeah,
I discovered them in NME in 1982. Fish was on the cover with face paint.
Yes.
They were the only band to headline a major festival called Reading Festival without being signed to a label. They were headliners. The headline for the magazine said, Marillion take off where Genesis left off.
That's true.
Yeah,
And here's an album I found that was released in '85 out of some guy's car here in Chicago. I don't recognize any of the musicians, but it got high ratings from Ken Golden.
Nice.
But that's an example of like a band that was around that was playing in the '80s, and they got no recognition, but they did release an album.
right. Yeah, there's so many, and like you're
Actually,
saying, YouTube is a great place to discover it.
And you can find those on people will rip their albums to MP3 and then put up some songs on YouTube, so you get a chance to hear it.
Yeah,
And
like,
I spend hours and hours on YouTube just perusing.
oh yeah, it's a great way, you can listen to new music, listen to new music, listen to music that you like, and where you don't want to go pull the CD off your shelf or the LP out of your shelf, and just go,
Well, as you mentioned, a lot of cases you can't find them; they're unavailable.
yeah,
So,
and that's the only way, to document those eras is if someone out there has that LP and they, out of the kindness of their heart, decide to rip it and put it up on YouTube for others, could be long out of print, won't be in print ever again, but you can visit it on YouTube.
yeah, and I found a couple of them. One is, hang on, I actually have the album sitting there. This guy worked for the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. They did the soundtrack to Doctor Who, but he did a couple of albums in the 70s.
What's the name of the band?
It's called Zygote is the album.
Okay.
It's released under the name Bert Alcantara, but it's actually produced by the guys at Electrophon. Electrophon was BBC.
Nice.
And this was kind of psychedelic electronic music.
Oh.
But this was an album that if I hadn't, I actually did own the album in the 70s, but I forgot about it, and then I just rediscovered it on YouTube.
Yeah, it's so amazing, that you can all of a sudden things that you may have forgotten that you listened to back then, and then all of a sudden
you can rediscover.
You can rediscover it. So
yeah, rediscovering stuff. Like a couple of years ago, I found an album that I had completely forgotten about. It was electronic music. Maybe you know that band, Neuronium?
Oh, yeah. I have all the Neuronium albums.
Well,
it was they called them crowd rock in the old days.
It was great. It sounded amazing.
They have a bunch of albums, and I like them a lot. And they played with Eno. Brian Eno did a few things with them.
Great stuff.
So, all righty. Well, it turns out my wife burned something, so I should probably get going.
All right. Well, I'll end it here, and hopefully maybe we can come back and do jump up 10 years to 1992 and see if we can find some gems from there. And I'm also hoping hopefully by the end of the year we'll get 2002, because 20 years. I was kind of thinking, it was all continue up to almost modern time, but no, the albums for the past 10 years, they need to how do you say? They need to brew a little bit more, and get a little bit more aged, before we can.
But even new albums, there's ones that I think are special, and then there's ones that I've listened to that I've gone back to that I purchased maybe a year ago, and I've gone back and listened to, and they just are not aging well.
Right.
I mean, how many times have you discovered something that you really loved, and then you'd listen to it 3 or 4 times, and you're like, this isn't as good as I thought it was.
Yeah, right. That happened. Yeah. That has happened quite a few times.
Or my favorite is buying something and you put it on and you go on.
What's this?
I'm a completionist, right? So I buy something by somebody, I got to have all their stuff.
Right.
So my thing is, I'll buy something and I'll go, oh my God, what is this? And I'll put it up on my shelf. And then one day I'll be walking through my music room. I'll go, I wonder what I can play. I have nothing to listen to. There's thousands of LPs and CDs, and I'm like,
nothing to listen to.
And then all of a sudden I come across something, I pull it out, and I'm going, what's this? I don't remember this album. And then I put it on, I'm going, oh my God, this is great. And I look at the year and I go, wow, this came out 32 years ago, and I just now liking it? What?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, how many times does that happen where you pick up something, and it doesn't have to be 32 years. It could be 5 years down the road.
Right.
But the first time, your first impression just didn't hit you for whatever reason, whether musically you were into something totally different.
Yeah.
Or it really was, they were so far ahead on that particular release that it just didn't make sense.
Right. Yeah.
It could be anything, you know. But then all of a sudden you go, "Oh my God, this is like the best thing since sliced bread."
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you know, I like the term. You were saying something you got 32 years ago, or maybe something you got today that was released 32 years ago. I always like to say it's better late than never.
Yeah.
You get it. But, you know, it's better late than never. You know, because I always see people on, especially on Facebook. You got that? You know, that was released X amount of years ago. I said, yeah, but you know, X amount of years ago, my mindset wasn't in sync with that album or that band. It you know, I think what it has to be is you got to be, you know, I guess in sync with what the music is, or else it's just not going to gel with you. And then, you know, later on.
What you're saying is exactly what happens to a lot of people. Some albums just grow over to you. When you listen to them at the first time, they don't click. And years after, oh, well, that's not bad.
Well, you know what also happens is our point of view changes as we age.
Yeah.
Even from week to week, and sometimes from mood to mood. I've noticed that for my taste. Sometimes I want to hear something that's really heavy. Sometimes I want to hear something that's light. It varies a lot.
Oh yeah, yeah.
My battery's almost about to die, but I just want to say one more thing about, you know, we're talking about how progressive. There are some bands that you can't really pigeonhole, but even though they're progressive, and the one artist I guarantee that all of us will agree with is David Bowie.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure.
Because you don't, you know, I mean, there's the stuff he did with Adrian Blue, which is very prog, very dark noir kind of prog.
Oh yeah.
Then he's done pop, he's done jazz, he's done dance music.
Oh yeah, he's done
rock.
everything.
He's even done punk. You know, I mean, he's done one of the most progressive artists out there.
Oh, for sure. He's even done electronic music with Roger Powell.
Exactly.
Well, you know, you said David Bowie. I mean, I always heard that term, rock's chameleon.
Yeah.
You know, whatever he's into, that.
Chameleon in general. So yeah.
Yeah, and
his discography is just absolutely insane. You listen to all of the albums; there are like 50 of them. I mean, it doesn't end.
Yeah. But he was always, you know, him and Miles Davis were very open-minded and always willing to hear something new and different. Miles Davis, when he stopped playing bop, they said, "Why are you stop playing bop?" And, you know, he got that hard time from Wynton Marsalis all the time. And Miles would just look at him and said, "We've already done that. Time to move on to something new."
Yep.
Exactly.
So.
Well, guys, it's
all right. Well, thank you very much for doing this.
It's been a pleasure.
I'm glad we got this done.
Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome.
Me too.
We'll see you in 10 years.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. It's been great fun. Good night.
Nice to meet you, Nick. Take care.